Welcome to Accelerate Science Now, where we sit down with innovators shaping policy, research, and industry to ask one big question. How do we make science move faster and work better for everyone? Today, I'm joined by DJ Kleinbaum, co-founder of Emerald Cloud Lab, a company reinventing how science is done with a remote-controlled scientific laboratory. We talked about how remote experimentation could make research faster, cheaper, and more reproducible, what it takes to automate complex lab work, and how this shift could open the door to a more connected, data-driven era of discovery. Enjoy the show. DJ Kleinbaum is the co-founder of Emerald Cloud Lab, a company that's reimagining how science is done. Instead of working at a physical bench, scientists using Emerald Cloud Lab can design and run experiments entirely remotely from anywhere on Earth. DJ earned his BS in biological sciences from Carnegie Mellon University and a PhD in chemistry from Stanford, where he developed new ways to use DNA and RNA as molecular tools. Before launching Emerald Cloud Lab, he and his co-founder built lab automation systems for their biotech startup, Emerald Therapeutics, creating the technology that ultimately became the foundation for the Cloud Lab itself. Today, DJ is helping lead a quiet revolution in experimental science, making it more reproducible, scalable, and accessible to researchers everywhere. So thank you, DJ. We're so excited to have you today.
Great to be here.
Great. Well, I would love to get started at the very beginning and ask if there was anything early on in your life that really inspired you to pursue a career in science.
I think the first thing that I really remember was being 14 or 15 and reading Engines of Creation by K. Eric Drexler and about like the coming nanotech revolution. And really from that point forward, I think this intersection of computer science and the life sciences really appealed to me and also to my co-founder, Brian. So both of our companies have been called Emerald because that's the name of the street that we grew up on. From that time, we were interested in starting a company at this intersection, which in the mid 90s, made you really weird, which guilty.
That was actually going to be one of my questions, was why Emerald? That's so cute. So you've known your co-founder your whole life?
Since we were seven. We were seven.
Wow, that is so neat. And I'm guessing you were both always really into science, even as kids.
Yeah, science and engineering, and I think that even as like a youngster, I understood that I was way too insubordinate to ever not start my own thing. Like if I was ever going to do anything, it would have to be that.
Wow, really cool. So I did want to ask about your early career as a scientist. Could you tell me what was that like? What were you focusing on?
So as an undergrad at Carnegie Mellon, I did a lot of work in computational biology and biochemistry, trying to model the binding sites of proteins so that you could add fluorescent probes to see when something had bound, which did not work at all. And then as a graduate student, also working in diagnostics, in trying to build better molecular tools for sensing, in this case, different types of bacteria in a culture. But I think any of my research advisors would tell you, I was a pretty middling scientist at best.
So did you always have an entrepreneurial spirit, knew that was where you wanted to go? Or were you ever like, oh, I want to be a true scientist, I want to work in a lab?
Never. I had to be dragged kicking and screaming to graduate school. And really, Brian and I both went to Carnegie Mellon wanting to leave and start a biotech company. And we got toward the tail end of our time as undergrads. And, we're talking to scientists, talking to entrepreneurs, talking to investors, and everyone told us no one will fund or let you run a biotech company unless you have 3 letters after your name. So you hear that a couple dozen times, and eventually we were like, fine, we'll go to graduate school.
Fine, we'll go get PhDs at Stanford.
Yeah.
Oh, well, cool. So what, for Emerald Therapeutics, what was the momentum behind that? How did that start?
Yeah. So I don't have a lot of particularly positive things to say about my graduate school experience. And I think my thesis advisor would say similarly. But
Hmm.
it did give me and Brian the better part of 5 years to vet dozens of different ideas for what this company that we had dreamed of starting from the time we were 14 or 15 would do. And the idea, the sort of driving force behind Emerald Therapeutics was sort of pairing this backgrounds we had in the life sciences with computation. And what if you could actually compute information in cells where that information is this cell infected with a virus or not? And if so, do something to to safely shut that cell down. And if not, let the cell continue living. And so this idea of bringing computation to the life sciences was the impetus for Emerald Therapeutics, because we were really driven by this idea of Eroom's law of, it's the opposite of Moore's law, which talks about how the cost of developing pharmaceuticals is increasing exponentially. And there were a lot of, in the mid to late 2000s, there were a lot of papers about this. And that was something we were trying to figure out a more systematic way to develop cures for in this case viral infections.
Got it. And was there, like, in working with Emerald Therapeutics, did something then inspire you to start Emerald Cloud Labs? Like, how far after one did the next start?
So before Emerald Therapeutics, like it was while Brian and I were still in graduate school, it was like there would often be times where we would call each other up. He did graduate school at Scripps Research in San Diego, and we would call each other up and be like, I don't think the emperor's wearing any clothes. And this is the value of a co-founder and a best friend, of the person on the other line saying, you know what? You're not crazy. Everyone else is crazy. It's ridiculous that we're using this incredible scientific instrumentation that is so sophisticated and costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. And the way that we store the data coming out of this really sophisticated instrument is we print it out and glue stick it into a paper lab notebook. That's crazy. And so we spent all of this time not just thinking about what Emerald Therapeutics would do, but how we would do it, and had this idea of what if you could have an instruction set for the lab, the same way that you have an instruction set for a microprocessor that's, like you can do whatever you want with that microprocessor using this core set of instructions. What if you could do the same thing for a laboratory? And so that idea predated Emerald, it came up alongside Emerald Therapeutics.
Okay, fascinating. So at one side, you're trying to, solve this problem that you guys have been interested in. On the other side, you're like, well, the way we're doing it could be helpful to so many other people.
Right. And, initially we just did it because, we were able to raise money for Emerald Therapeutics, which I still consider to be a minor miracle, because summer of 2010, not a great time to be raising money in biotech, especially if you were a couple of nobodies right out of graduate school, which we were. That was fine with us because, the amount we raised was very small relative to our ambitions, but we had all these crazy ideas about how you would run a R&D organization in the 21st century, which basically had two core tenets. One was laboratory automation. So every experiment had to be push a button, walk away. So we invested a lot of the initial money we were able to raise in automated instrumentation so that we could do that. And then the second was to teach all the scientists the few scientists who we actually could afford to hire, how to write software, and not like low level. We weren't teaching them how to, do memory management or cache validation, but just enough so they could build tools to make themselves more efficient. Because if we made them really efficient in the lab, but then they spent all their time analyzing data in Excel, like that's not a win. So we wanted to build software tools so that they could control the lab and also that the lab would be automated. And that took, that was a very iterative process, like over the course of 4 years. In the first 4 years of Emerald Therapeutics, we're both pushing forward the scientific research but also building all of these tools alongside of it.
Yeah, and that was going to be one of my questions that so you have scientists, but they clearly, yeah, have to also be software engineers or know how to do software programming. Like, who are you hiring software engineers or are you teaching software engineering to scientists? Like, how does
Uh,
that work out?
Generally, so our scientific development team are all top flight scientists who have learned how to write software in in this internal language that we've written called symbolic lab language, which is basically the middleware that connects, that turns science into software. So those people from the beginning have always been, top scientists who we've trained how to write software, not software engineers who we've taught science.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. So I guess stepping back a bit, both for listeners and for myself who are not familiar, how exactly does Emerald Cloud Lab work? Like, can you paint a picture of what it means to run experiments in the cloud?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's look at this from two perspectives, from the perspective of the scientist using the system, and then from the perspective of what's actually happening inside the box.
Hmm.
So for scientists using the system, we have a software application which you can use from anywhere in the world to design experiments as if you were in the lab standing in front of the instrument yourself. We have a no-code interface, so you basically are just like choosing from a graphical menu, like any button or knob or switch that you could turn or push if you were standing in front of the instrument, you can do through the software to design your experiment. Once you've designed that experiment, that experiment has to get validated by a set of software checks that we run to make sure that it can be safely and successfully executed at our facility. And so that happens effectively instantaneously as you're designing your experiment. And then once the experiment is accepted, it goes into an execution queue. And then it's started at our flagship facility in Austin, Texas, generally within 5 to 10 hours of you submitting it. So then the experiment starts, it runs according to your exact specifications, and then when it's done, all of the data and metadata is handed back to you through the same software application, which also has a whole suite of tools for analysis, visualization, plotting, basically figuring out what happened in your experiment, and then you can decide what you want to do next. So that's what it looks like from the scientist. You design your experiment, and then some time passes, and then you get all of the data back. What happens inside is that the entire lab facility is controlled by software. So it's not necessarily fully automated, but it is fully procedural. We do have staff that work in this facility 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And what they are doing is they are executing the experiments according to the science's exact specifications. So my joke is that, our job is to faithfully execute the experiment exactly as specified, not to add anything to the science. In other words, our facility is effectively a factory for doing science that is agnostic to the science that's done there. So what happens is a checklist of instructions gets generated, and that checklist is both for the people and for the automated robotic. So it might tell one of our operators to gather certain materials and then take them to an instrument and put these things in particular places. And the way that we're able to make this reproducible is every time an operator has a physical interaction with the lab, something is happening so that what they're doing can be checked, whether it's with a barcode scan, sensors, probes, something is happening that is effectively checking their work to ensure that the right thing is being done at the right time in the right way. And then, so let's say they take all these materials, they put them onto the automated instrument. And then once they're done, the software has the instrument take over. It says, okay, here's the experiment that the scientist designed, run it exactly this way. And the operator's off to something else. So our workforce is very malleable, unlike a traditional lab where a technician might do what they call in manufacturing science, like a rabbit chase, like start the experiment and then run it all the way to the end. An operator will only work on an experiment until a point at which the instrument is able to take over. Then they'll go work on something else. And when that instrument is done with the scientist, with that step of the scientist's experiment, the software will grab another operator and have them take all the stuff off the instrument. And it can and usually is someone completely different from who set it up, because, the entire all of the robotic instrumentation and all of the people in the lab are viewed by the software as resources that it's managing to make the lab run as effectively and efficiently as possible.
Right. I can imagine that makes a huge difference that like these, I imagine, very expensive instruments can just like keep working on like whatever's coming next and not have, someone's, I guess, I don't know, like rented it for the whole day. I guess it would also be
Right.
useful to what's the usual process of like if a scientist wants to run an experiment, but they don't have like where do they go to get access to all these instruments? How does that usually work?
Yeah, I mean, as a graduate student, it was beg, borrow, steal to get access to instruments. I mean, so for an academic lab, our lab at Stanford was relatively well appointed, but there were still things that I needed that we didn't have, and so usually you're leaning on a core facility. So there were facilities at Stanford where you went and signed up for a block of time, and then like when your appointed time came, you hoped that you had all your stuff ready to like show up at the instrument and use it. In some cases, toward the end of my time in graduate school, I had to do these long runs on a fluorimeter, on an instrument that measures fluorescence over time. And I had to do these really long runs, and you could only sign up for runs longer than an hour between, I think it was like 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. So I would effectively like camp out on the lab couch all night, because every 4 hours I'd have to like change samples. So it would be like change sample, prep next sample, like go sleep on the couch for 3.5 hours, then get up and like very sleepily change it again. And that's all the sort of like manual labor aspect of it. I wasn't adding anything to the process. That was just what needed to be done to generate the data, because that was the only way to get access to that instrument.
Right. And you physically had to do it yourself, arguably not at a great time that you like have all of your facilities about you in the middle of the night. So
Yeah, wasn't great.
no, so it sounds like what you guys are producing is really exciting and very important. Can you, like, who are some of the people that are using it? Like, not by name, but like, are they all over the world? Are they within the US?
Yeah, I mean, we've had customers, over the past few years, we've had customers in Australia, we've had customers in the EU. Most of them are predominantly based in the United States. And these days, most of our work is with top 20 pharmaceutical companies, and especially those groups in sort of the latter portion of the pipeline. So people doing product development, CMC, and especially quality testing.
Got it. And can you give some examples of like some of the exciting experiments that have come through the lab?
Yeah, I think that, we've had people do everything from testing novel materials for making solar cells to trying to develop, novel therapeutics. We've worked with groups that are even doing like some type of like material science for semiconductor development. We've had a bunch of, during the pandemic, we did a lot of quality checking for people who were trying to develop faster COVID diagnostics. So
Mhm.
better and like more efficient testing, but they were having supply chain issues. So they were basically checking all their suppliers using our instrumentation.
Wow. Yeah. What a great example of how necessary it is.
Yeah, it's been. I mean, the funny, like the thing we always say though is, our job is to be like the world's greatest roadies for scientists, right? Like we are not actually doing the science. Our job is to be here to support the people who are doing the cutting edge science.
And you're tons of different applications. How many different instruments do you have at the lab?
That's a great question. The last time I checked, we had over 220 unique instrument types available at the facility. And for some things that are, under high demand, like chromatography instruments and mass spectrometry, we have like multiples of each type. So I think the total number of instruments we have is probably well over 400, but it's something like 220 unique types of instruments at the facility.
That's really impressive. So a scientist, runs their experiment, gets the results back. Let's say they're not happy with the results or something really unexpected happened. Do they get like an entire transcript of every single thing that happened so they can look where they might want to make a change?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's part of the really valuable aspect of it. Like when I was, working at the bench, you write down in your lab notebook the things that you think are important and not necessarily all the things that necessarily matter to the experiment. So, for example, there was we worked in like a very old building as a graduate student, and there was this one particular reaction that there was this sort of like lore in the lab, like don't run this if it's raining, because it was a very hydroscopic reagent, like very water sensitive, and we had no humidity control. And so the thought was like,
Mhm.
if there's more moisture in the air, it will affect the yield of your reaction. And two problems with that. One, no one ever actually tested that to like actually like run like side by side and see if it matters. And two, I promise that when that reaction got published, it does not say anything about controlling the humidity in the lab in order to achieve this yield. And so our goal is to collect all of the data and metadata around your experiment. Whether or not you think it's important, it's
Mm.
all there. And so you can actually, if you ran two experiments that you expected to be the same and they weren't, you can actually do a side-by-side comparison of all of the data and metadata to see what's actually different between those two runs. And in that way, we are really pushing toward making sure that everything that runs in our facility is reproducible, because we know exactly what the world looked like when you ran that experiment.
Right. That was actually my exact next question. Is I know that reproducibility is a huge problem for conducting science. Can you comment on like why that's so important? And as you explained, like how you're able to do that, but just yeah, why that's so important.
Yeah, one of our longest tenured team members always says Emerald is a communications company, because that's really what we are trying to do. We're trying to solve this communication problem in science. And I think we all sort of intuitively understand this in other fields, like cooking. Like if I go out and buy a cookbook written by a Michelin star chef, you wouldn't have the expectation that like that night you're getting a Michelin star meal, because there's so much that sort of goes unsaid in a recipe. And the way that method sections in scientific papers traditionally work is the same thing, is that there's so much that, you can't cram into English prose, even if you wanted to, that you're just trying to give the reader your best guess at like, here are the parameters that I think matter to run this experiment. But no one does sensitivity analysis on that. And so as a result, it's not, when you see all these studies about how unreproducible published papers are, that's not malice. This is a communication problem. And so what we're trying to do by capturing all of that in software is to solve that problem.
Got it. And that seems like that can be huge for accelerating scientific discovery. It would be great to hear from you like how you envision cloud labs if they, expand what that could mean for scientific discovery.
Yeah, I loved when you spoke to Jason Kelly from Ginkgo. I loved he talked about something that is also a huge passion of mine, which is uh, abstraction. So, when you're like working at the bench and like pipetting like individual vials, your experiment succeeding or failing can come down to like, did I pipette into that well yet or not? And so, in the same way that with programming languages, we started with assembly language where you're like really like giving the processor very direct instructions. And then you moved up to things like C, where you are still very clearly connected to the microprocessor. You're assigning addresses in memory. And now you have programming languages where there's not even a sort of like conception that you're connected to a physical machine anymore. And that really hasn't happened. We are just at the very beginning of that happening in science, where you're allowing people to sort of like move up those layers of abstraction in bridging the world between like atoms of what's actually happening in the lab and bits, what you can control reliably with software.
Got it. And so I think a lot of people when they hear like AI and automation for science maybe get concerned about the scientists not being as involved,
Yeah.
rather than, maybe having more room for creativity. Could you comment on that a bit and how you've seen that in the lab?
Absolutely. So I think that, so first and foremost, like I think, it's a lot of the challenge with like AI and science right now is, as one of my computer science professors used to say, it's kind of garbage in, garbage out. Like if you're just
Mm.
feeding these method sections, which are underspecified or many of the variables are unspecified, you're not going to be able to build reliable experiments on top of that because you don't have that like strong foundation. So I always view this as, I think it's going to be a very long time before we can like take the scientist out of science, but at the very least, you should be able to use computational tools, AI or otherwise, to do a better job of sort of like pruning the tree of possibilities as you're trying to move through a scientific program to accomplish a particular goal.
Got it. And can you give an example of how can AI do that pruning? Like, what is it going to recognize that maybe a scientist wouldn't?
Yeah, I mean, I think the ability to, for example, to do that type of sensitivity analysis and say, okay, like we've, it might look like we've explored all the possibilities of, along this particular trajectory, but actually, like, there's this whole variable space that we haven't looked at yet. And usually, like, those might be things that just the number of possibilities that you can chase after is so large that you need help to actually try to refine that and to sort of like carve the most efficient path to the solution. One of the other aspects of bringing AI to bear in science that I'm very excited about is the ability to actually take take existing method sections and analyze them to highlight areas of where things are not specified or are underspecified. And from that, you can actually generate a list of like, hey, if we want to actually run this experiment, here are all the things that we should be testing to see, they didn't specify what the material that that the testing vessel was made of. So, here's one in quartz and here's one that's polystyrene, and let's test them both and see if it affects the results. So those are the types of ways that AI can assist scientists going forward to make sure that the science they're doing is more reproducible.
Yeah, and makes sense that it's like speeding things up in a way that they don't have to like go through and read the entire thing and recognize like where could those extra tests be run. I'm curious what the most surprising thing that you've learned watching different scientists and researchers use the cloud lab in interesting ways.
I think that in some ways there's really like an interesting I don't want to say like it's not a generational divide, but it is like a mentality divide in science. So you still have your brand of scientists that are very much like some faculty members that I knew in graduate school who would tell you things like, you'll never understand a chemical reaction unless you hold the vessel in your hand. And just a very sort of like, I would always say like artisanal approach to scientists. Like it's much more like the sort of chef mentality of science of like, what's the right number of equivalents of, base to add to this reaction? It's like, much. That is something that, and so there's a divide between sort of like that area of science and the much more sort of like, I'd say like programmatic area where people who view these tools not as something that is inhibiting their creativity, but something that empowers them to do more and to make their science things that can really be built on because it doesn't require their hands to make it happen.
Got it. And that I think leads really nicely into my next question, which was, all right, so building a completely new model for conducting science is not, an easy thing to do. What were some of the biggest early hurdles? Were they, technical, cultural, financial that you had to deal with in founding Emerald?
All of the above, I think. I think the most interesting one maybe is the cultural one because there are any number of technical challenges, and there have certainly been plenty of financial challenges along the way. But I think the cultural ones of really trying to have scientists see themselves more as builders than explorers. A lot of scientists want to be like the first one to do something. But really, if we're going to move this field forward, we all need to be building progressive levels of foundation that the next scientists can all stand on top of. And I think that that type of cultural shift is very much still in process. We are not there yet, but I think that people are starting to recognize the value of software tools and computational tools. There was a very long time when, and this may actually still be the case, when the word code does not appear on any Emerald literature, because that was such a turnoff to so many
Wow.
scientists that we were just like, the word code is like verboten. Like we will never say that.
That's
And so
crazy.
I think that, you're starting to see changes there, but, cultural change is always slow.
Yeah. And I mean, so have you had to like convince any scientists to use Emerald Cloud Lab? Like at the beginning, were you having to like try to get people to do it? Or right away were people super excited and were like, oh yeah, this is like a way better way to conduct my experiment?
We've been lucky that we've always managed to find early adopters, in academia, at startups and big companies. There are always early adopters, but I still think we're still in the process of trying to convince people that this is a good idea and that this is something that is designed to be empowering to them, to make them to give them more leverage, to make them more powerful as scientists, not something that they should be worried about or scared of. That's, we're still in that fight.
Right. Well, and I can also imagine some of I mean, I guess I don't know in practice, like the scientists that are conducting experiments, do they need to know any of like the software engineering side, or is that really all on your staff to figure out?
They don't need to know any of there's an enormous amount of work on the software side that goes into uniting all hundreds of these instruments under a single interface. Like they don't have to know any of that. And we've certainly tried our best to build this no-code interface in a way that's really accessible and easy to learn. I always think that it could be better, it could be more accessible, it could be easier to learn, but we've spent a lot of time invested in trying to make this, we're not trying to gatekeep this from everyone, or from anyone. We are trying to make it as accessible as possible to drive experiments using the Cloud Lab.
Got it. And I know you've talked a lot about democratizing access to the lab. What does that ideal world like look like to you? And what do you think is standing in the way of that happening?
Yeah, so I think escape velocity is a function of price point. So I would love us to get to the point where you can start and conceivably like run a scientific startup company for the same cost as a software startup, excluding all these like giant AI companies with like all the GPUs, but like a more traditional software company. So we're talking hundreds of thousands, maybe like single digit millions of dollars, not like tens of millions of dollars, or in some, recent fundings, like hundreds of millions of dollars. I think that the idea of being able to expand access and drive down the cost of scientific research is really important for opening that field up to new ideas and, to places that otherwise like have not had access to, top of the line scientific instrumentation.
Got it. And what would you consider those places? Is that like, developing countries or underserved communities? Like who are you picturing could eventually use a cloud lab to run experiments?
Really, it's anyone who's not at a, top tier research institution or like major, high end, like scientific company, like a pharmaceutical company or like top ag company. It's otherwise like there's a lot of stuff that it's hard to get for people to get access to, both the quality and diversity of instrumentation that it can take. So if you look at what happened with, with computation, with computers, when they moved from, giant room sized things that you had to be at a giant company to be able to afford, to things that sit on your desk, all of a sudden, there are a lot more people that could program computers, and you had the personal computer revolution. I think that it's tools like Emerald are going to enable that type of letting outsiders in to science that we just have not seen because access is such a problem.
That's so exciting. Has Emerald Cloud Lab partnered with any like smaller universities or community colleges to like have that access? Is that something that you guys are thinking about?
It's something that we're thinking about it. Right now we sort of have that's very much like part of the dream, but right now so much of our focus is on solving quality control for these larger quality control and quality testing for these larger companies that we are still trying to use economies of scale to drive it to the point where it makes sense for them and for us to be able to provide this level of access. So it's something that I get up every day thinking about, but we're not there yet.
Right. And what do you think needs to be done? Is this like government intervention? Do we just need like more private funding going into ideas like this? What's needed to really increase the democratization of a cloud lab?
I think it's a combination of things. So one is economies of scale. So just getting this large enough that it makes sense to be able to distribute that utilization over a larger group of people. I do think there are reasons for governments to be involved. I'm not sure that wouldn't necessarily be high on the list. I think it really is just about getting it to the point the where the unit economics make sense for all parties there.
Right. Because I imagine like you guys can probably only run. Is there a certain number of experiments you can like run in a single day on the instrumentation you have?
Yeah, I mean, you're ultimately any facility is going to be limited either by the instrumentation or by people, both of which are like very scalable. But one of the challenges for us has always been predictable demand. So if we know that people are going to be running, 100,000 experiments over the course of 6 months, that's very easy to plan for and predict. But oftentimes, especially with smaller companies and academics, it's, on, off, on, off, on, off. And that from a business planning perspective is more challenging. So that remains something that as the facility grows, as the user base grows, we're able to amortize that utilization over a larger group. So it gets easier for us to let more people, to provide access to more people on the system.
Got it. Makes complete sense. And that there's like really a barrier there for like, okay, well, if we're going to build like a whole new facility because we have all this more demand, like that's a huge cost. It's not like, oh, we can just slowly scale up.
Yeah.
Got it. Yeah, makes sense that that's a challenge there. Looking ahead in 10 years, say that, Emerald Cloud Labs has expanded tenfold, that there's, yeah, cloud labs are the new big thing. What do you envision is the typical day for a scientist?
Yeah. I mean, I think for us, the vision has always been to do for laboratory science what companies like TSMC did for semiconductor manufacturing. So the rise of fabless semiconductors. I would love for the same thing to be able to happen for scientific research, that you are effectively opening up your laptop and looking at the data that came in, from overnight, and then based on that deciding what experiments you're going to run going forward. So that idea of being able to collaborate, collaborate remotely, to be able to have distributed teams, and to be able to have those teams able to work together in a way that is where they are abstracted from the day-to-day science, where whether or not an experiment worked doesn't come down to like, did I pipette into that well or not? That they are actually able to live more in the world of ideas than the world of like manual labor. I think that idea is going to enable new generations of scientists, and you'll see the the increase in productivity both of the scientists and of the industry as a whole as a result of being able to empower this labless biotech generation.
Really, really cool. I love that both like the themes of democratization, but also of like making it more of a community thing that like so many different people can be like working and building towards the same thing at once. Um, DJ, are you currently running any experiments? Do you still do that, or are you just
I
just entrepreneur now?
I do not.
Really?
I do not. And even, I always say, like, we've hired way too many good scientists and engineers at Emerald, so it has been probably close to a decade since I've contributed anything to the code base, and they really only let me in the lab anymore to give tours.
Well, bummer. Do you have any aspirations of someday going back into a virtual lab?
My business partner Brian would tell you that, like, his dream is to make Emerald successful enough that he can buy himself, like, the largest possible account on ECL and then go live in a cabin somewhere and just design experiments, like, and basically just be a workaday scientist all day. He was a much better scientist than I ever was. So I think it will take a lot there. Always have a few projects, like, in the back of my head, but I think that they're probably, like I said, like, my goal is to be the world's greatest roadie for scientists.
Mhm.
I know enough to know my limitations in terms of really driving innovative science forward myself.
Well, it's good to know both your strengths and weaknesses, I suppose. Lastly, I just wanted to ask, what would you say keeps you the most excited about where science is headed?
I think it's the growing interdisciplinary nature of science, that all of these lines that used to be very clear between, biology and chemistry and material science are really blurring. And, it would be very hard now to say, like, I'm a biologist or I'm a chemist or I'm a computational biologist. All of these things are becoming just tool sets that people can access to make things happen. And I think that that is really exciting. That, when I was going to undergrad and I told people I wanted to study computational biology, I had people who looked at me like I was crazy, who would say things to me like, why don't you study physics and French literature? They have as much to do with one another as computer science and biology. And those days are over. And I think that's really exciting. And these generations of scientists that have subsequently been educated and are still being educated, everything is the intersection of different scientific disciplines. And I think that is incredibly exciting.
Yeah, wow, that's really beautiful. Well, DJ, thank you so much. It's really exciting what you're working on. I can't wait to see where Emerald Cloud Lab goes.
Thank you. It was great talking with you.
You've been listening to Accelerate Science Now. I'm your host, Adeline DeYoung. This show is produced by Kindred Subjects, Accelerate Science Now, and Seed AI. Our executive producers are Josh New and Austin Carson. Special thanks to Kevin King for editing and production. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.